listeners. Welcome to the 17th lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century Anglophone novel as practiced by a selected group of women writers. I ended the previous lecture with a brief quote from the introduction, an essay written by Jeanette Winterson to the 2007 Faber and Faber edition of Nightwood. I will continue reading that preface, read a couple of passages from T.S. Eliot's 1937 essay, and then begin talking about some of the immediate biographical and social contexts which shaped the world of Nightwood. So, in the first passage, Winterson tells us that Nightwood must be taken in, or it must be consumed like a food simply for its texture and its external appearance without worrying about the nutritional value of it, to stay with the food metaphor. Winterson further goes on to contextualize the world of Djuna Barnes and Nightwood and says things about the historical context from which the book emerged, and also tells us that the context actually doesn't mean anything, or rather, it is simply a biographical fact, a sort of accident of history. We cannot really get to a better understanding of what is happening in Nightwood simply by placing it in the right historical and cultural moment. So I'll read a couple of passages because the writing it's just that good and it deserves to be read again and again. And it's a testament to the power of Nightwood as a novel and the power of Winterson's engagement and thought and writing and feeling about this book and the kind of inspiration that Nightwood has for Winterson herself, but for many other writers as well. And it's just such a great invitation for all of us to place ourselves in the most receptive possible position with which to enjoy, appreciate, and to try and understand what is, honestly speaking, and it must be said, not an easy text to read. Nightwood is not easy, and we are grateful to Winterson for stating it on the very first page that it's going to be a challenge, but the argument also is that it's a challenge that repays the effort more than compensates the time, energy, and effort that one invests in reading it. So, why should we read Nightwood, and why does Winterson say that we should put in this kind of effort? So, the first justification for reading such a difficult text is that it is difficult and that itself is its value. So, this is how Winterson writes. Nightwood is demanding. You can slide into it because the prose has a narcotic quality, but you can't slide over it. The language is not about conveying information, it is about conveying meaning. And then a little bit later, Winterson quotes from Gertrude Stein, who said, "There is no there there." And this sentence has two meanings, obviously. There is no there, meaning that the language does not describe reality in the way that communicative language usually does. So when I say, for instance, that this is a table, I am referring to an object. The word table refers to the object that is table. According to Gertrude Stein, the way that language is used in works of high modernist art, language does not describe a reality that is immediately next to it. So language does not mime or describe a physical reality. In fact, language describes other forms of realities. The kind of communication language does itself is a matter of creative deliberation. So, modernist writers have earned for themselves the right to devise connotative, denotative style of articulation. So, how language communicates reality itself is something that modernist writers remake on a case by case basis. They don't use language in the way language is used, let's say, in a dictionary or in a newspaper report or in a medical report. That's the first meaning of there is no there there. There's also another meaning, which is there is no there there. There is an expression that's used to console someone. And that meaning is very important for Jeanette Winterson, who says that There is no consolation in Nightwood. Now, this statement is important. There is no consolation in Nightwood is a comment about not just the kind of writing there is in the book, but also the kind of world from which this writing emerges and the kind of attitude and response the writer is creating with her readers. Consolation is something that might have been appropriate. There are adequate reasons in the world for a writer like Djuna Barnes to produce and provide consolation in her novel to certain kinds of readers. What is that consolation? The consolation for the persecution of homosexuality, the consolation for the refusal that certain people have to face, the refusal to exist, the denial of certain people of a right to have feelings, to be human in the most basic ways, the overwhelming pressure some individuals face, the shame that individuals are forced to live with, which has been known to drive individuals to suicide. These are all things that require consolation and which would make consolation the necessary, appropriate, and dominant emotion produced by a text. However, that's not the case here. That is Winterson's point. Consolation would be appropriate, but it is not offered. And what is offered becomes or eventually brings readers to realize, the book brings readers to realize that even though it is not consoling them in the ways that they might have expected the book and the writer to console them, what they get from the book is something that might be more appropriate than merely consolation. It is a kind of celebration, it's a kind of energy, it's a kind of despair, but that's tinged with a kind of excitement, the excitement of creating language which communicates and which produces meaning in a way that is completely unheard of. Reading Nightwood and reading the kind of language that exists in it, readers are surprised and shocked to know that it was possible or it could have been possible to use language in this way. That is a kind of consolation, not the kind of consolation readers typically expect, but maybe more useful. And anyway, that is the gamble. That is the risk that the writer has taken, and that is the risk that Winterson is asking readers to take as well. It's something that they owe to themselves as well as to this writer's effort. Now, further, Winterson describes the historical and cultural context and has a comment to make about the relationships between three women, that is, Robin, Jenny, and Nora. And this is how Winterson prefaces this interaction, this triangular interaction between these three women. Robin's passivity, Jenny's predatory nature, and Nora's passionate devotion make an impossible triangle. The daily assaults of selfishness and self harm do not offer a picture of love between women as anything safe or easy. A negative reading would sink us into the misery of the invert, the medical pathology of Havelock Ellis, and the bitterness of Radcliffe Hall and the Well of Loneliness, published 1928. So, this is not Nightwood. Nightwood is very powerfully and carefully avoiding these sorts of emotional stances. Now, what is Nightwood then? We get the answer to that question a little bit later, and this is a paragraph that goes thus. Nightwood has neither stereotypes nor caricatures. There is a truth to these damaged hearts that moves us beyond the negative. Humans suffer, and gay or straight, they break themselves into pieces, blur themselves with drink and drugs, choose the wrong lover, crucify themselves on their own longings, and, let's not forget, are crucified by the world that fears the stranger, whether in life or in love. So, a few key ideas to note here before we move on. It's a move from defining identity in a somewhat narrow sense to defining identity and identifying the value of reading literature in universal human terms. The audience, or at least one set of audiences that Winterson is addressing in this paragraph, are readers and scholars who have identified the work of Djuna Barnes as valuable, and Nightwood in particular as worth reading because it describes or signifies or symbolizes or represents in some way the experiences, the anxieties, the challenges, and the jubilation, the trials and troubles of a particular kind of human being, that is, lesbians, or at best, if not so narrowly defined as lesbians, then same sex individuals or homosexuals. And Witterson's point is that's not the case. It is about humanity, and human beings do not need to belong to a particular sort of sexual orientation, do not need to be defined by their preference of a particular type of partner in order to be able to appreciate what's going on here. And what's going on here is something that's part and parcel of all humanity. And what is that? The fear of the stranger. So, the fear of the stranger takes the idea of the persecution of homosexuality and places it in a much wider historical frame. While homosexuality itself can evolve, and the attitudes to that particular identifying factor of humanity can evolve, the attitudes to this other kind of factor, which is the fear of a stranger, that is much more tenacious. That one dies much harder than attitudes to or whether or not certain kinds of relationships are right or wrong. We are living in a time when a lot of countries in the world are beginning to realize that homosexuality is not a crime. So slowly, that kind of a fear is no longer central to defining the identities and lives of many people. But does that mean that the challenges of individuals who come from minority backgrounds are over? No, those challenges will always remain because human beings will always have this very, very deep seated fear of the stranger. And so when Winterson says that this book is dealing with something as primordial and as primitive and as defining of the human species as this kind of a fear of the stranger, then reading a book like Nightwood increases the intellectual stakes infinitely. Further, Winterson writes that even though it's important to note the historical context in which Nightwood was written, this is a book that really transcends all of those contexts. And I will read one particular context of that, which is for Winterson, Nightwood was written at a time when American and other women, but especially in America, women were in the headlines for multiple reasons. And what are some examples of women who were in the headlines? In the UK, Winterson writes, 1936 was the year of the abdication crisis when Edward VIII chose his American mistress, Wallis Simpson, over the English throne. Further, in America, other women were in the headlines. Margaret Mitchell published Gone with the Wind, and Claire Luce Booth's stage play, The Women, was taking Broadway by storm. That year also saw the start of the Spanish Civil War, as I have mentioned in my biographical and historical survey earlier. So, these are some important contexts, but Knightwood merely happens by historical accident to be situated next to these contexts. What happens in Knightwood needs to be received and appreciated first and foremost as events that concern a few individuals, and having concerned a few individuals, they happen to concern the writer of the novel. That having happened, they concern us, the reader. That is all. So it's important to close the boundaries of the text during our first encounter with it, and then to just let the influence of the text percolate in that closed chamber, as it were, and then to open it up and understand what that interaction, what that amalgamation of experiences and anxieties means when it is placed in a wider historical context. So, and Winterson ends with some more description of the personal nature of the power of her engagement with this book. And I want to spend some time on that because ultimately, this course, while it refers to historical and human forms of identity in its very title, 20th century English novels by women, it's actually also much more powerfully about the act of reading. And I've chosen these novels because they test and they force us to crystallize our experiences of reading. And to some extent, this course is designed as a series of meditative reading experiences, reflections on the texts as closed entities, initially as closed entities, and then a series of closed entities when examined together, when examined as being in dialogue with each other, and finally as being in dialogue with the historical and intellectual past in which they existed. So while those dialogues exist, the first stepping stone for understanding those dialogues is a closed encounter between the mind and the text. And so a text like Nightwood is perfect for that kind of a reflective, meditative, closed encounter simply between our mind and another mind, the mind of an author who has produced this extremely refined and powerful work of imagination. So here is how Winterson ends. Nightwood, peculiar, eccentric, particular, shaded against the insistence of too much daylight, is a book for introverts, in that we are all introverts in our after hours secrets and deepest loves. Our world, this one now, wants everything on the outside, displayed and confessed, but really cannot be so. The private dialogue of reading is an old fashioned confessional, and better for it. What you admit here, what the book admits to you, is between you both and left there. Nightwood is a place where much can be said and left unsaid. For the rest of my life, I will be climbing those stairs with Nora to the doctor's filthy garret. Why? Something of Nightwood has lodged in me. It is not my story or my experience. It is not my voice or my fear. It is, through its language, a true shot arrow, a wound that is also a remedy. Nightwood opens a place that does not easily skin over. There is pain in who we are, and the pain of love, because love itself is an opening and a wound, is a pain no one escapes except by escaping life itself. So these are some very powerful words, and one has to wonder why Wenterson writes in this extremely powerful and sometimes disturbing and definitely very disorienting way when the point is to simply get some more readers or get some more people to read this book. I think it's an extremely persuasive pitch for reading this book, and I think it leaves us all with a sense of what were the intellectual, juridical, as well as textual opportunities that were available to writers like Djuna Barnes, writing at a time when attitudes to homosexuality were so obviously repressive, but also writing at a time when, alongside those extremely repressive views about individuals, about humanity, there also existed this extremely revolutionary and optimistic idea about the radical potential of writing and reading what someone else had written. These acts had been posited with a great deal of intellectual power, as we know from imagism, from modernism, from all of the avant-garde movements of the time. So we can see in Nightwood a testament to the power of revelation that writing contains. Reading Nightwood reveals worlds to the reader, and it continued to reveal those worlds to readers in 1936, and it continues to reveal those worlds to readers in 2025 as well. What are those worlds? Those worlds are not simply about the persecution of homosexuality or the need for reform or even the argument for a more compassionate definition of humanity. Sure, these are some of the obvious ideas, some ideas about the diversity of human experience and human sensibility. But ultimately, what the worlds that Nightwood reveals will be unique and will be very, very limited to the mind of every reader. In a way, this seems to be not a very great thing to say about a book because, in a way, one could say that's true about every book. What's unique about this book? Everyone makes their own meaning of a book that they read. So, why should more people read this book? And the answer to that is Nightwood is a book that can reveal multiple worlds and it rewards multiple readings with multiple revelations. And it is the power of creating a permanent and undeniable or something that will always stay. The experience of reading Nightwood creates a little corner of one's mind which will always remain Nightwood. And this is what Winterson means when she writes, I will always be climbing those stairs with Nora for the rest of my life because something of Nightwood has lodged in me. I will move now to the next prefatory material, which is also a sort of a sales pitch, but written many, many years ago. This was written in the year 1937 by T.S. Eliot. And those of you who admire or have interest in reading T.S. Eliot's prose, as I do, will find this to be a very interesting document. T.S. Eliot is obviously very, very well known as a poet, but I happen to find his prose and his criticism and nonfiction much more interesting. And I am happy to report that T.S. Eliot's preface to the 1937 edition of Nightwood does not disappoint. It is, like Eliot's other prose, extremely self reflexive, but not abstruse. The language is very elegant, flows very, very smoothly, and has moments of quiet intelligence and wit. So, what's the story that Eliot is telling us here? Eliot tells a story about how he went on a journey, how he read multiple drafts of this novel from when it was being composed to while it was being prepared for publication, and finally when it was ready and printed and published as a book. And the reason he read it so many times and the reason he's still writing a preface is because he found something in the quality of its prose that he admired a lot. And what is that quality? For Eliot, this is prose that will be appreciated by those who appreciate poetry. This is something that Eliot takes a lot of time to explain. And he says that language in this novel is elevated, distilled, crystallized to the level of refinement that one finds in poetry. Other novels, compared to Nightwood, read like newspaper reports or technical reports, whereas this novel, it uses language in a way that speaks to the heart and the core of human experience. This is the first claim that T.S. Eliot makes. I'll now move to the second half of the prefatory essay, which is where I believe T.S. Eliot struggles a little bit with his own somewhat conservative sensibility and certainly his somewhat conservative ideology, which is that I think I have a fairly informed guess on this, that T.S. Eliot found it difficult to sympathize with the allegorical version of the story. That is to say, T.S. Eliot would not find it easy to support the kind of legislation or support the kind of social and legal reform that maybe 3 or 4 decades later could be seen as following in the wake of Nightwood. So, to put it even more plainly, I don't think that T.S. Eliot was sympathetic to the cause of same sex friendship, intimacy, or homosexuality. T.S. Eliot was more likely to see the characters presented in this book as inverts. Inverts is a phrase that Winterson used and which I quoted. Originally, it was a word that came from Havelock Ellis, which pathologized homosexuality. T.S. Eliot struggles with his own inability to accept this full, diverse range of human experiences as deserving of the label human. Because for T.S. Eliot, the language in this book is so powerful and so compelling that it ends up challenging even those somewhat reductive definitions of humanity. So, this is how Eliot struggles with it, and this is how Eliot reconciles himself. The book is not a psychopathic study. This is what Eliot says. The book is not a psychopathic study. Eliot feels the need to clarify because he feels that for many readers, and I think for even a version of the reader that he is sometimes, it might seem that describing the lives of people, the kinds of people whose lives are described in Nightwood, and placing so many of them together in one book might make a study not a novel, traditionally speaking, but as an exploration of strangeness, weirdness, like a freak show, or something like a psychopathic study. Freak shows were actually very popular in early 20th century and late 19th century America. The miseries, Eliot writes further, the miseries that people suffer through their particular abnormalities of temperament are visible on the surface. The deeper design is that of the human misery and bondage, which is universal. In normal lives, this misery is mostly concealed. Often, that is most wretched of all, concealed from the sufferer more effectively than from the observer. The sick man does not know what is wrong with him. He partly wants to know and mostly wants to conceal the knowledge from himself. In the Puritan morality that I remember, it was tacitly assumed that if one was thrifty, enterprising, intelligent, practical, and prudent in not violating social conventions, one ought to have a happy and successful life, and so on and so forth. So, this is a remarkably insightful statement for me. And I, for one, when reading this document from 1937, was quite amazed to find some resonance between this statement and some of the ideas or some of the critique of normalcy that I have been reading about in my own research and teaching in disability studies. The simple idea is that ideas of normalcy are ideological constructs. Nobody is normal, but some people have managed to describe their functionality as normal, and anyone and everyone who departs or doesn't align with those functionalities gets labeled as abnormal. This is the idea in modern disability studies scholarship. Here, through a poetic appreciation of a work of creative writing, T.S. Eliot here arrives at a somewhat similar conclusion. The idea that sickness is not known. The statement, the sick man does not know what is wrong with him. The statement is not really about sickness. The statement is about the unacknowledged or less understood forms of disability and abnormality that are hidden under the surface of what gets passed off as normal. Similarly, the statement that human misery and bondage are universal, but these in normal lives, these miseries get concealed. So T.S. Eliot, despite all of his conservatism, is brought to this moment of insight in making an effort to account for the power of writing in Nightwood. And this is where I'll stop in this lecture before moving on to a study of the text in subsequent lectures. Thank you.